U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper warned that U.S. alliances, including the future of NATO, were in jeopardy if European countries went ahead with using Chinese Huawei technology in their 5G networks. By early 2020, China's tech giant Huawei is poised to deploy most of the world's 5G infrastructure.
We have shipped more than 600,000 5G AAUs, over 91 commercial 5G contracts.
Where the reality we face as a nation is of ever-increasing cyber warfare and seemingly ceaseless variations of intense, perhaps even weaponized economic competition.
In June 2019, Keith Krach, former CEO of DocuSign, was unanimously confirmed by the Senate to run U.S. economic diplomacy as Undersecretary of State.
This Ohio boy, who began his journey welding parts and later had the good fortune of welding together billion-dollar companies, has had the blessing of a true all-American dream.
The Silicon Valley billionaire would take on the Chinese Communist Party, and one of its urgent missions was to defeat their master plan for controlling the future of 5G communications.
The United States has developed a comprehensive approach to address long-term threat to data privacy posed to the free world from authoritarian malign actors. It's called the Clean Network.
All right, good afternoon. In case you're wondering, I'm Andre Fuetsch and
Keith Krach.
Keith Krach. So, hey, Keith, thank you for joining us today. We have the, I guess we're the last stop before happy hour. So let's see how we can get through this here. You know, we started out the session this morning with Peter Thiel, and you know, he gave us a pretty good, interesting perspective on China and some of the big technologies, principally AI, and some of his views on what's going on. I want to ask you, you know, with your tech background, everything that you've done to make it easier for people around the world to access and transact more securely, more efficiently in this new digital domain we're all part of. We're seeing a lot of interesting and concerning behaviors and actions. You certainly are privy to a lot of things that probably the general public doesn't get to see. And we certainly know that companies like you showed in the video, Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent. We had an interesting discussion earlier on TikTok. These are increasingly becoming some pretty major tools for China government surveillance program. And you have been working quite rigorously here to not only expose this, but also working with folks such as our former National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster's, in developing this sort of clean network alliance for democracies that you've been taking around the world and gathering support for. Can you tell us more about what this trust doctrine is all about? And how should we think about this, especially not just with China, but with other nation states that are really taking advantage of these unprecedented powers that they have?
Sure. Well, Andre, and by the way, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. You know, I'm just an Ohio boy and ended up in the business world. I never thought I'd be running U.S. economic diplomacy. And you know, it happened because of DocuSign. You know, we had dual headquarters, San Francisco and Seattle, right down the road. And this was a few years ago. DocuSign was up to about 500 million unique users around the world. We're in every major country except for China. And whenever we go into a new country, I'd usually go on a 2-week listening trip. And I've been going to China since 1981. I'm a lover of Chinese history, the culture, the people, certainly the food. I went over there, but this time it was different. I could see that General Secretary Xi's Market competition is amped up into a new form of aggression. I had a chance to see their drone swarm technology, a lot of things that Eric was talking about. And as I'm flying back from China, I'm thinking to myself, you know, the guys with the best technology win the war. These guys are up to no good. And certainly you see General Secretary Xi now is the most powerful dictator in the world ever since 1945. And he has unlimited ambition. So I went off to government. I went out to Washington because I wondered what they know. I ended up they ended up asking me to go serve. And my mission, my charge was to develop and operationalize a global economic security strategy to drive economic growth, maximize national security, and combat China's economic aggression. Because China is playing the long game. They're playing for keeps. They're playing a game of four-dimensional military, economic, diplomatic, and cultural chess with very little respect for things like rule of law, respect for property, respect for sovereignty of nations, respect for the environment, respect for human rights. And technology is at the crossroads of that. So one of them, and by the way, one of the things that when I got that charge, well, what do you do as a CEO? Well, you bring in a high-performance team. So I brought 12 folks in from Silicon Valley. I also brought in the Dean of Engineering from Purdue, who's going to be the next president. And we mixed them together with the career Foreign Service officers. These are some of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. They speak 4 to 7 languages. They're North Stars national security. They work their tail off. They could be making 5 times more in the private sector, regardless of all the drama that goes on in domestic politics. These guys are professionals. And one of our urgent missions was to defeat the master plan. The Chinese Communist Party can control 5G. And all previous efforts had failed at that point because their number one most important company, their national champion for 5G, and the backbone of their surveillance state that enables their genocide, it looked like they were going to run the table. And both sides of the aisle were hitting a panic button, and previous efforts had failed. And that's where we came up with the trust doctrine. Because it was interesting for me in my first 60 bilaterals as Undersecretary with my foreign counterparts, finance ministers, foreign ministers, economic ministers, I'd be in there with them and I'd say, hey, how's your relationship with China go? And they go, oh, they're a really important trading partner. And it seemed like almost every time they look both ways and they go like this, but we don't trust them. Now that rang bells in my head because I'm standing a year ago, I'm standing up in this hotel in front of our big user conference and going, we're not in the software business. We're in the trust business. We deal with people's most important documents. Those are the ones you sign. And trust is the most important word in any language because you partner with people you trust, you buy from people you trust, you love people you trust. And I'm like going, well, if there's any trust business, it's 5G. And that was the doctrine we used to combat what we called authoritarian regimes' power principle of coercion, co-option, concealment, deception, seduce with money, reinforce with intimidation. And those trust principles that form trust doctrine are things that we honor. Things like integrity, accountability, transparency, respect for rule of law, respect for property, respect for all those things that define our freedoms. And, Andre, let's maybe pretend I'm the Chinese company, okay? You're the American company. If I can steal your intellectual property, I don't have to be transparent. I can use these big coal-fired power plants. I can use that slave labor over in Xinjiang that's exported everywhere through China. I'm either the law or I don't have to obey the law. I'm going to beat you every time. And, George, I'm a supply side guy and I believe in the free market. I believe in free enterprise. But when somebody comes in that market and doesn't play by the rules, the market is no longer free. It's a fool's market. So you got to do something about it.
That's why we architected the $280 billion Chips and Science Act, because what's the alternative? And anyway, we end up defeating their master plan for 5G based on this trust doctrine. And it really went back to one of the questions I was asked in my Senate confirmation hearing when Senator Cardin said, well, what will your strategy be to combat China's economic aggression? And I said I would harness the U.S.'s three biggest areas of competitive advantage by rallying and unifying our allies, leveraging the innovation of the private sector, and amplifying the moral high ground of democratic trust principles. And that's what that was all about. We also, the prior efforts were failing because folks before me, they tried everything, but they were going around banging the table. Governments, like the ugly American, saying, don't buy Huawei. I remember like my first week on the job, they said, you got to go over to the Italian embassy. Your counterparts there, the economic minister, he goes, you got to have a poolside with him. I go, what should I talk with him about? They go, well, give him the 5G talk. I go, what's the 5G talk? They said, tell him don't buy Huawei. And I just go, that's the stupidest friggin' thing I've ever heard in my life. If somebody comes in, you're the CEO, says don't buy it, I'm saying to my chief of staff, hey, check out that stuff, must be really good. And I said, nobody likes to be told what to do. So I said to the guys at the State Department, they thought it was revolutionary. I said, why don't we treat these countries and these telcos like a customer? Nobody likes to be told what to do, and the customer's always right. So we need a value proposition for them to partner with us, and that's kind of what we did. So by the end, in less than a year, we formed a Clean Network Alliance of Democracy, 60 countries, representing 2/3 of the world's global GDP, 200 telcos, and a whole host of industry-leading companies that stood for those trust principles. And those 91 Huawei's 5G deals went down to about 12. And that was important because the pricing model was so low that companies like Microsoft, Dell, Cisco, they were coming into the 5G market because of that pricing umbrella. They couldn't make money. Well, we lifted that. Now everybody's coming in, and hopefully we'll gain some ground on 6G. But the most important thing is what we want to do was develop an enduring model that and using the urgency of 5G to do that. So perhaps one of the greatest things is this model now, the trust doctrine, built a bridge between a Republican administration and a Democratic administration. And the Biden administration has picked up on all these different principles.
Okay, great, Keith. Let me shift now to the elephant in the room, Taiwan. You've been a strong voice on standing with Taiwan. Back in 2020, you were the most senior U.S. diplomat to visit Taiwan. Taiwan's de facto ambassador to the Washington, B. Kim Sao, dubbed you Taiwan's #1 friend. As part of your mission to counter China's potential invasion, you designed a 6-pronged strategy to deter Beijing's aggression by creating an economic security blanket around Taiwan based on this trust doctrine you just described and its partners. Let me ask you, Keith, because a lot of folks are saying, what do you say to these folks that are saying, that are feeling we can't afford to go to war with China, especially not with what's going on over in Eastern Europe with Ukraine? What do you say to those folks?
Well, I say nobody wants war. But I can tell you one thing. Taiwan is a linchpin of democracy, and they're a role model of freedom to all of us, to the free world. To General Secretary Xi, what Taiwan represents is it dispels his myth that the Chinese culture cannot live in a democracy. It has to live in an autocracy, and he wants it destroyed. The other obvious thing about Taiwan is it's the home of semiconductor manufacturing. Taiwan punches above its weight. The most important industry in the world. And if something happens to the Taiwan semiconductor business, it'd be disastrous for industry and absolutely catastrophic for the high-tech business. And so this Six Prongs Initiative was all about putting the security blanket around. You know, when I went to Taiwan, I was the highest ranking State Department official, go there in 41 years. I was greeted with 40 fighters and bombers. They didn't like that very much. And I won't go into all the things that we did, but one of the big things we did is we did the largest onshoring in U.S. history with the most important foreign company, United States National Security, and that's TSMC. And they, when they announced their $12 billion plant in Arizona, because we were having a tough time too getting Intel, Samsung, Micron to build their semiconductor plants in the United States. Because back then, even though we invented this industry, only 12% of semiconductor manufacturing was being done in the United States. And we couldn't get them off the dime. So one of the key strategies was, well, if we can get TSMC and we get Intel and these other guys to follow suit. And that's exactly what happened. And by the way, and we get TSMC's ecosystem, which is equally as important to come. That's happened. A few months after we announced TSMC, Intel announced a $20 billion expansion in Chandler. Now that's up $100 billion investment in Ohio. Samsung came into Texas, $17 billion. Micron came in, $14 billion. And that was really where we began to architect the CHIPS Act, part of the Chips and Science Act. Previously, in November 2019, we architected the Endless Frontier Act, which is at $200 billion of research funding. So this is critical. And so one of the other things, when I was over there, we laid the groundwork for an economic prosperity partnership. And that partnership is the most encompassing partnership the U.S. has with a country. Everything from semiconductors, manufacturing, to economic empowerment of women, all those kind of things. And then that also laid the groundwork for another thing that we signed a month later, the Science and Tech Act. And what that was all leading up to was a trade agreement. Trade agreements are really important with countries. Here's why. This is what I learned. When the United States does a trade agreement with another country, it creates a halo effect for the private sector. And then the private sector, U.S. private sector comes in and invests. And when the U.S. private sector comes in and invests, so do our allies. And so if our allies are more invested in Taiwan, then they will be more likely to defend Taiwan. If China chooses to come in and do something about it in terms of kinetically, it's also important too, and politically too, we got to make sure the right people get elected in Taiwan. So that was part of that key security blanket. But make no mistake about it, Taiwan is absolutely key. And now with Xi and his unlimited ambition, his stated goal to bring Taiwan, he's going to be in for the fight of a lifetime, I think. And I think it was a real wake-up call when you saw Putin's bloody invasion of Ukraine and the courageousness of the Ukrainians against all odds. I think the Taiwanese are just as fierce and better armed.
Let me ask one last question, and I want to open it up here to the audience. So if you want to queue up for some questions, be ready here. You touched on a wide spectrum of issues, principally around China, Taiwan. Let's talk about this Uyghur genocide that's going on. How does that play into this? And we're really poking the bear here. How does that factor into the overall policies that you've been advocating with Washington and actually getting some fairly strong bipartisan support? Tell us a bit more about the Uyghur situation.
Well, first of all, it's just the right thing to do to call it out. After World War II, we said never again. That's when the United Nations put together their definition of punishable genocide in 1947. which if you look at what's going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghur population, you can just check it right off. And, guys were reticent to label it as genocide. In July 4th, 2020, I was on national TV. I labeled it as genocide. And I remember coming back to the State Department going, hey, I read the legal definition. It's genocide. And now all these other countries have recognized that. This is something that is beyond belief. They have 380 internment camps there. And here's the thing that has ramifications, I think, when you look at it from a business perspective, to kind of connect the dots a little bit. They use this Uyghur population as slave labor. Probably sounds familiar if you think back in history. And they're using this in their solar panel business. China owns about 90% of this solar business. Industry analysts say that solar will make up 50 to 60% of our energy in 2050. They do it all in Xinjiang. Why? Because it's two biggest coal-fired power plants in the world there. That's their coal region. So they use dirty coal and they use Uyghur slave labor. The average cost for that labor is about $300 a month. So try to compete with that. And they're using this dirty coal. And by the way, it's energy intensive process. The amount of solar energy a solar panel puts out in 3 years is the equivalent to the amount of energy you need to manufacture it. So for all you guys who have the solar panels on your house, it's made with dirty coal and slave labor. And so if you look at what the United States have been doing, well, we've been financing that. Well, how have we been financing that? Well, a big one is through all these ESG funds, because those Chinese solar companies are in there. And if you look at the definition of ESG, E is environmental. So these guys are using dirty coal. They're the biggest polluters in the world. S is social. The number one thing about social is human rights. The United Nations just came out with a report of crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. And then G is governance. What's the number one thing in governance? Fiduciary, financial, how do you do your book? And those books are so opaque. These companies don't follow any GAAP accounting principles, anything similar to it. You can't audit them. They're the only companies, Chinese companies are the only ones on a NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange that can't be audited. So think about that. So should any Chinese company be in ESG? I would say none should be, because if you miss one, you're disqualified anyway. They miss all three. There was just a case at Wharton on this that our team wrote up. So if you look at this, well, the technology that they're developing with this slave labor is perpetuating that surveillance state. It's 1984 Orwellian. And that's what enables the genocide. And these are tools that the worst of dictators could have only dreamed of. So you connect the dots with that. It's all interrelated. But in terms of what they're doing in Xinjiang, it's just not right.
Okay, Keith, we've got George up here for...
go to questions, yeah.
Well, we can agree that it's not right, but called genocide is really a bellicose way of characterizing policies that the Chinese would depict as corresponding to our policies in the Middle East or whatever. The Uyghurs have been the fastest growing population in China. It really seems to me peculiar to apply to various policies that we don't like toward the Uyghurs and toward all the rest of the people in China, for that matter, to the population that's growing fastest. I mean, that's not genocide. I mean, you could, and the use of this term strikes me as being kind of needlessly inflammatory, provoking the very policies that we condemn and making our credibility, weakening our credibility in the world.
Well, what I would say to that, George, is go read the 1947 United Nations definition of that. And one of the things we said was never again. And the parallels are staggering. I'm not saying that there's not other places in the world, but you know, I'll tell you what. You know, I grew up in Ohio. I saw what the weapons of mass production had done to the heart of our economic engine. I saw when I was a VP at General Motors, you build a plant in China, you're not just giving them intellectual property. You're giving them process engineering, training their people, and they're coming again, and they're subsidizing. It's put you out of business. At Ariba, the company before DocuSign, where we invented business-to-business e-commerce, Alibaba, he stole our intellectual property. You know, there's a National Intelligence Act. I didn't know this when I was CEO of DocuSign. There's a National Intelligence Act that requires any Chinese company, state-owned or otherwise, and any Chinese citizen to turn over any information, proprietary technology, or data upon request to the PRC or the PLA or the CCP, which is all one and the same. And if you don't, the consequence if you don't, you're going to prison, or your grandma's going to prison if you're here. So, you know, what I saw, though, at the State Department, George, was beyond my imagination. And there is no regard for human life. And he's now got the unlimited powers. So, and by the way, we enabled him, George. We all did. You know, we looked at him with rose-colored glass. We brought him in the WTO. We all believed that capitalism would equal democracy. Well, they fooled us on that one. So now it's time to take off those rose-colored glasses you're wearing and not treat them as we hope they be, but how they really are. I really believe that from the bottom of my heart after seeing all this stuff. And I love the Chinese people.
Well, the only point to make is that during this, we do deal with all sorts of oppressive regimes in the world. I mean, we deal with Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, for example. We're all kinds of oppressive regimes. But during the period that we dealt with China, the 4 leading companies in the world who benefited most were gave the United States the 4 top market cap companies in the world, plus the 6th and the 8th and the 9th. I mean, we went from having 4 of the top 10 market cap companies in the world to having 7 of them, and cooperating with China. And I just...
And by the way, George,
my fear is that in our insistence on treating China as an adversary that with a lot of military shows of force and provocations, that
we didn't shoot any missiles in the Taiwan Strait, George.
We'll end up hurting ourselves more than we hurt China. It's already happening in semiconductors. For all these gains you're talking about, the Chinese semiconductor capital equipment companies are growing 5 times faster than our capital equipment companies at this point. And anyway, I just think that we got to be shrewd in our policies with China, not just kind of talking about genocide misrepresenting what's actually happening. I don't think serves our interest. But anyway, that's my...
George, I respect your opinion. You're a wise man and a great patriot. But I also respectfully disagree. You know, history's repeating itself with what's going on in China. We saw a lot of companies make a lot of money in the 30s, in Japan, in Germany, and they came to regret it, especially the financial institutions. So unlimited ambitions and unlimited power don't add up to a good thing.
If this is your first year at COSM, this is one of the best subjects to poke the bear, George Gilder, on. So it was fun with Newt last year, too, so I really appreciate you, Keith. This is fun. Next question.
Okay. John Wallstetter, Senior Fellow, Discovery Institute. How are we doing with regard to finding workarounds for the rare earth elements that are hugely disproportionately concentrated in China and also in Afghanistan, which the Chinese are trying to move in on there as well?
I'm a little hard of hearing. He asked about rare earth and
yeah, rare earth materials. Yeah.
So how are we doing? Well, we got a lot more we need to do because that's critical because China owns that. And you know, the rare earths aren't really that rare. They're everywhere, but China owns the contracts to them. They own so many of the mines. You know, you look in the Congo where cobalt, they basically own all those mines there. But the most important thing that they own is the processing plants in China. And they do it there because in some places they have gangs that do it because they environmentally, those processing plants are unregulated. And they own that market. And I'll tell you, that is so important to our national security because it's going in not just semiconductors and things like that, but especially in the clean energy area and in battery technology. So here we are. You know, by the way, we learned in the past that energy security is national security. Wars are begun and they're lost because of energy. And so you want to have in 2050 where China can cut us off at any time. They own the energy market. So this is something. It's a great point you bring up. This is something that we've really got to jump on. You know, you think, you know, one of the key things is a thing called polysilicon. And that's just really just sand. That's not rare. But where is all that made? It's actually made in Xinjiang because it's also very energy intensive. 90% of polysilicon goes into solar panel business. The other goes into semiconductors. So it's from that to lithium to cobalt all around the world. And that's something, you know, this is all a society effort. And this is one of the reasons why you've seen, you know, probably over the last 5 years, our government jumping on this because we saw what happened to those supply chains during COVID and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, good point.
Keith, just to follow up on that real quick, would you argue then that ESG is actually throwing those industries deeper away from the United States? Because you talked about the environmental aspects, which we have huge trouble with. Do you think that's continuing to drive those like rare earth material type of projects outside the United States?
Well, we're not in it. So we need to invest in that business. We need to bring processing plants here and figure out a way to do it that's safe for the environment, because that is national security right there. If China controls those supply lines and that supply, we're in deep yogurt. And you know, there's a lot of things going on right now. And this is where we really got to leverage the private sector and really rally them.
The private sector is already producing ways to harvest rare earth elements from electronic refuse and waste. I mean, that's, but if we really have some big government program to make rare earth processors all over the country, they'll be eclipsed by various new ways of converting existing electronic waste and recovering the rare earth elements in it.
And in British Columbia, where I'm from, a Canadian, we are already developing rare earth sites and mines. The problem has been we lost all our people who knew how to work with it.
Right.
It wasn't anything else except we lost it all because China paid for them and we didn't. However, as a Canadian, I'm in a more totalitarian environment than you. We have 3 official Chinese police stations in Toronto to intimidate our local populace. So that's not so much my question, except one warning. Let's not consider the term Chinese as being monolithic. There's the Chinese Communist Party, which is totalitarian and just plain evil in many ways. But many, many Chinese companies, and I've talked to entrepreneurs who talk about the tip of the red hat, who say, yes, Mr. Z, no, Mr. Z, and then try and go ahead and do what they can. So let's not make everybody Chinese as just one thing like that. However, that's not my question.
And by the way, I usually begin and I say, look, this is nothing against 1.2 billion Chinese that are not part of the elite Chinese Communist Party, right? This is Animal Farm, right? Everybody's equal, some more equal than other.
Correct.
I totally agree with you on that, by the way.
One thing, November 15th, the 8 billionth person will be born. But we hit peak China. Already born. Yeah, that's what I'm told. All right, so my question is on the demographics of China with the disastrous policies of Mao that decimated their youth. What is your projection for the coming population collapse that we are about to see in many areas?
Yeah, well, it's already having a big effect because if you look at the marrying age of the Chinese population, there's 40% more men than there are women. That creates problems, and you're seeing that on their One Belt One Road initiative, where they export their laborers around the world, and all kinds of things revolve around that. A lot of human trafficking, sex trafficking. Prostitution in these sites, all of this kind of stuff. So it's already has manifested itself in many ways, but it's going to really hit them when you look at this one China policy when their population gets older. And just like Eric was talking about, that's why productivity is so important. They're going to need a lot of robots because they got to pay. They've got to support their older generation. So, yeah, and by the way, that's one of the things that is really giving a sense of urgency to General Secretary Xi. I mean, it's no secret that their ambition is to be the global dominant superpower on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, which is 2049. Now, we saw him accelerated before our very eyes, particularly when COVID hit. With his aggression at the Indian border and co-opting Hong Kong and eviscerating the citizens' freedoms. And he has that sense of mortality, I think, that he wants to do it on his watch. And one of the reasons, too, is the demographic thing in play.